2668, Private Kurt J., en route to Sellian Theater. As he sat in his chair, he listened to the rumblings and clamor of young men and women around him. It was a moderately sized leisure room, with ever-present gray metal walls and bright overhead lights that kept the halls and the room in perpetual daytime. As he turned from his seat and away from a digitally powered viewport, he saw what the commotion was all about. They were young and all dressed in similar attire to one another, sporting black tactical boots, gray and black camouflage trousers, and a black environmental undersuit they wore without the shirt. For some, it revealed little; for others, enough to let the mind fantasize. However, he did little to stare as he then focused on whom the crowd gathered around. It was Moran and Spears engaged in ground combat. It was another facet of their culture, to test and gauge one another's skill and stamina in a contest of either grapple or fists, and among the lower enlisted, it was a community event. Since graduating, Moran had grown his mass to a decent size, with Spears as well, putting on muscle that made his opponent look small by comparison. The two were locked in their contest, with Spears having the edge over Moran, with his arms over his chest, restricting his arm movement, and forcibly spreading Moran's legs to deny stability. Spears had him struggling, and it could be seen by Moran's exhausted breathing and defeated form. In a last-ditch effort, Moran decided not to fight against his larger opponent, instead using the moment of driving his free right hand under his body and twisting his left side over onto Spears. This caught him off guard and landed the two on their backs, with Moran swatting away his opponent's arms and swiftly crawling under it into an armbar. He pulled and lifted his hips, causing a sharp pain for Spears as the motion was too quick for him to react. He felt a sudden pain, and in the next moment, tapped out before he broke something. Defeated, Spears laid on his back, while Moran stood tall over his opponent, causing the crowd to holler at his victory. After the match, the two greeted each other with a handshake and laughter as the two coached one another on how either could have done better. As they cleared the arena, another pair was set up to compete, and another set of cheers rang out in the room. As he continued to watch, he saw a figured approach from his right with an extra drink in hand. It was Cameron. "Could have sworn Spears had that here," he replied as he offered a drink. "Yeah, it always surprises me how nimble that guy is," replied Jay as he took a sip of his drink. After their graduation, Jay and most of his platoon were immediately sent off on a military transport ship to the front lines. The trip totaled almost 6 months if they were going to reach their destination, but that's only because they had planned supplementary training prior to their first combat deployment. This was because even if they were fresh from boot camp and knowledgeable in a controlled environment, they still needed to get accustomed to dealing with raiders who have seen combat and to be trained by them. Today just happened to be one of those days. Small unit tactics. A lesson that would take place in an onboard simulator. But first, they had to attend a class that was due to commence shortly. The door to their room had then opened, but it was unnoticed by the crowd until the individual spoke loud enough to silence the entire room. "Listen up," he said, garnering the attention of all who were present. "Start heading to the training classroom so we can get this brief over with. Take it seriously because your lives will depend on it." It was an older man than the rest, who stood at average height, but had a tired expression upon his face mixed with stern conviction. He wore the same clothing they did, including his blouse, which had a visible red tab across his shoulder and his rank stitched in the center. He was Sergeant Faith and his squad leader. "Aye, Sergeant," sounded his comrades as they began making their way to the classroom. They put on their blouses and departed, Jay and Cam included. The room they had left led into a hallway that had a long series of displays that revealed the black void littered to the brim with distant stars and gaseous clouds forming dynamic backdrops. He was just glad they weren't near a star, or it may have blocked out the scene before him. "Think it's only classes, or are we actually going to do the sim?" asked Cam. "I heard it's both. No sense in not doing sim," replied Jay. "I heard they're working on updating it with enemy models, here soon before we actually deploy. For now, it's apparently going to be set with pirates instead." They continued down the hall, following the other raiders through a door, which led down a small hall and into a larger room filled with several rows of seats, enough for all the new blood. From what he could see, there wasn't a single person who held a rank higher than corporal that was participating. seeing how most were fresh from the depot, and those who were at least a corporal had a white mark stitched on their shoulders, showing that they at least had time in service. Beyond that, they were all new, and this was their first briefing in the fleet. As all were present, Sergeant Faith stood at the forefront of the room, and before him was a large projector that was flush with the floor, and he walked across it with disregard, as it was intended. "All right, listen up," he began. "I'll get through this quickly so that you have more time in the sim, because Lord knows you need more practical experience than you do death by holo presentation. Eyes up." He then stepped off the platform, and it came to life as soon as he did. He then spoke as a large figure unfamiliar to them was depicted, except Jay remembered what they looked like, even if it was a vague memory. "What you see here is our main enemy combatant, the Celian trooper. I'm sure you've seen some combat vids from raiders in the field, but here's what we know. Pay attention because there's more to them than you think," explained Faith. He pressed a button, and the image changed to several more Celians, but with slightly varied changes in armor and vast changes in color palette. "Here's what we know. The Celian military can be categorized in two parts. You have your sailor, as seen here in clothes rather than armor, then the trooper, who are the only ones who wear armor, but they can further be divided into even more separate categories. But first, there are key differences between their sailors and troopers, namely, in body size. From what has been declassified for official use, the sailors have a lower muscle mass compared to the troopers, so they're not really the ones you should worry about." He then showcased a sailor and trooper Celian side by side, showcasing the clear and distinct differences they shared, which were vastly different from how he thought of them. The troopers are a special case, as it's been researched that those trained for infantry combat will gain advanced growth of muscle mass and height. This is true for most troops who dedicate themselves to learning and perfecting the ways of ground combat. "Moran, what is a troop?" he asked, to which the raider in question stood up and replied, "It's their version of a unit, or command. While they sport the same armor as the general army, they differentiate themselves by decorating their armor in the unit's colors and insignia," said Moran. "That's right. They separate themselves into troops, and that is where their loyalties lie, to their troop commander. But back to what I was saying earlier. Celian troopers will, on average, be larger than their weaker counterparts. We don't know how they are trained in CQC, but it's fair to assume they may have some degree of skill that can prove lethal. However, what we've seen so far says that they may not be well versed in hand-to-hand, but instead favor overwhelming their enemy with numbers alone. That's why you need to be effective in ranged combat, and to be prepared for when they overrun your position. So for our time here, I encourage you to all practice and grow efficient in hand-to-hand. Who knows how many of you will have to use it." From there, Faith continued with a detail of Celian weapons, 3 of which have been recorded thus far, and moved on to how they have employed tactics thus far. From current vids and analysis thus far, they did little in the way of actively engaging their enemy, opting for holding a position until they had more soldiers than their enemy before they advanced. It was a constant they had seen, making it noteworthy for field teams to take advantage of. Faith continued, "Unfortunately, we don't have proper models of the enemy, so it won't be one-to-one. Instead, for tactics, you'll go against the worst, but only after we gradually increase the difficulty. Now, don your armor. We're hitting the sim. Have a fire team ready by the time you get there. You'll be going in 2 groups of 4 at a time," ordered Faith. The room then began to get louder from the sudden shuffling of occupants as they exited the classroom. From there, they headed towards the armory, where they stored their armor and were granted their weapon of choice. Each person was allowed 1 primary, a choice between the S8 and the S4, with each person receiving their standard sidearm, the S2. "What are you going to pick?" asked Cam as he placed himself beside Jay, who was finalizing his gear. "Might give the S4 a go, since they authorized us to use it for the sim," he said, eyeing Cam and the auto rifle he chose. But as much as he liked the reliability of a well-maintained rifle, he had always wanted to try the Badger, as it was called. He would always see them in brochures and weapon shops, but they were usually out of his budget, so he generally disregarded them for other, cheaper variants or brands. "I'm telling you, Kaler knows how to make them," added Cam as he wielded the weapon to get a feel for it. It was sturdy in construction, and it was lightweight, a feature that was a must for any combat unit as it reduced overall fatigue. This was offset, however, by its heavier internals so that the user could maintain superior recoil control. Paired with their hydraulic recoil dampening system, it lessened the need for a full-stroke bolt carrier, reducing weight effectively. Overall, it was an amalgamation of superior recoil control and weight reduction, a time-honored commitment of the company. When he secured his upper chest armor, he went to the armorer and offered his identification, to which he was granted the Badger and the sidearm at his request. He took it, along with his non-lethal ammunition, and looked over it in admiration. It was compact and light in his hands as he ran them through the weapon. Racking the bolt back and letting it fly forward was a must for most weapons, and the thudded clang of it locking in place was satisfying. Like the S8, it had a hydraulic recoil dampening system as well, but was a closed bolt with no need to eject a casing. It added to his silent nature, and he had dreams of using one, with that dream unfulfilled. He then placed his magazines into their respective pouches, and he and Cam were met at the entrance by two friendly faces. "Hey, you two, need a team?" The first to speak was the same man who had wrestled with Moran, Spears. "Yeah, we didn't exactly form a group on the way here, so this works out," replied Jay. When he accepted, the person beside Spears wrapped his arm around Jay in an endearing manner. His name printed on his name tape was labeled Fields. "That's the spirit. Come on, let's rock this practical," he said, but not before Spears spoke to calm his spirit. "We already told Sergeant Faith you two were our teammates, so we're going 6 next after the first group," said Spears. The arena-styled room they had entered was large, with the biggest area being the arena itself, with the seating arrangement taking even less space. Near a set of 8 doors that were raised above the floor, their sergeant stood, waiting for the rest of the raiders to attend. When most were present, Faith began. "This is your first time here at the sim, so I'm going to give you a rundown. Behind me are your sim pods. You'll get in, and it'll lower you to the arena's level where you will begin your scenario. Now look below." He directed their attention to the arena itself and saw that it was littered in a large array of squares and bland teal coloring. To monitor for physical fatigue, we're running live, not with a data sim. Each of you will be given one of 2 scenarios, each reflective of possible Celian environments. Urban and shipboard, added Faith. While he said there were only 2 scenarios, each instance would be randomly generated as soon as a group entered their pods. When he was done, the sergeant called for the first group. "Moran, Steele, your fire teams are first. Load up." They did as he ordered, and situated themselves in a shell of a pad, fit only for the square hole it rose out from. It lowered the occupants, and the arena below them began to shift. The tiles rose well above their height until stopping in line with the floor the onlookers stood on. When it settled, Faith walked atop the arena as it was enclosed with thick, reinforced glass, and began to speak. "Fire teams, are you ready?" Moran spoke, and his voice was carried through a series of speakers, as did the others. "Ready. Good. Your scenario is generated, and your enemy projections have occupied the space. Neutralize the enemy, then return to your pods for extraction. When you're ready, exit your pods and begin," said the sergeant. As he said, the doors of their pods opened, and a crowd began to gather at the corners of the arena and looked below. The 1 teal tiles were now colored and seamlessly depicted that of alien-styled architecture. The form of the tiles were relatively short in their width, reflective of a ship's interior. The group moved clumsily as 2 separate entities as they began clearing through the interior. The 2 teams populated 2 different sides of the ship as they began encountering their Celian stand-ins, pirate models. They were crudely dressed, with out-of-date gear and shoddily made repairs, but they seemed fearsome to say the least. They were made with hard light projection, a technology made several years ago, and recently made available to the military. It offered the most realistic environment to train without having human opposition. The technology was still new, and most present had never even heard of it. Exasperated oohs and ahs were sounded as the enemy popped into existence and began populating the rooms Moran and Steele had yet to clear. As they moved through their rooms, they started off stumbling past one another, but slowly as time went on, their movements began to slowly attune to each other, with Moran taking the lead. "Watch your corners. Brett, get those doors," he ordered. "Ready, go, breach," he replied, and opened a section of the wall that was depicted as a door, and the tiles lowered, revealing the room and their adversary. Jay figured it had cost them a fortune to implement this tech into a military transport ship of all things. However, it was said that this version was a last-generation model, with a newer version implemented at their destination, an assault-class carrier owned by the ODR, the TRSC arm of Sol. He watched as the two groups made their way through the halls, shooting at the enemy with simunition rounds and watching as the hard light hologram dissipated. He could tell that it was indeed last-generation tech, with even later software, as he noticed minor glitches in the program, but it did its job nonetheless. Moran continued, as did Steele, though their relatively short collection of rooms before coming to an end. Like before, each leader gave their orders and breached through their doors and into a large central area. Cover was plentiful and spaced evenly through the final area as the two teams took to the closest cover to them and concentrated fire from the pirate programs began firing into them. Everyone watched with a deep focus, wondering how both were going to pass their practicals, but Jay was confident Moran would come up with a solution. Cam thought the same, as did Spears and Fields. "That's a lot of firepower. Look, the pirates are about to flank," noted Cameron, directing the three's attention to the left and right of the group. It was standard tactics to, first, overwhelm the enemy with volume of fire, then, with a smaller group, move to the flank. It was an old tactic, but it worked more times than he could count. This was due to the reason that their suppressive fire could be anything. Tanks, machine guns, hell, even rockets could work to suppress the enemy. For Moran, it was a test that he could prove himself, and everyone who knew him believed he could do it. And he did. Moran turned to his team and spoke to words nearly inaudible to the onlookers, but yelled over to Steele his plan. "Crossfire! My left! Your right!" he ordered. Steele looked over and noticed with his angle an advancing enemy closing in on Moran and took aim to fire. Moran did the same and began firing into each other's flanks, effectively ceasing the enemy advance. Meanwhile, those who didn't support their flanks fired towards the rear of the arena where the concentration of fire originated, causing the overwhelming fire to lessen as the pirates were programmed to simulate reacting to oncoming fire. This allowed Moran and Steele to advance in a dead sprint, tossing their reserves of sim grenades behind enemy cover in addition. With each explosion, the enemy lessened until the two were on top of the enemy position. Behind their cover, the pirates cowered, not noticing the presence of the two, who, without feeling any remorse, fired into the projected training simulations, causing a buzzer to sound the end of their practice. Cheers were heard from the onlookers, and when the two teams returned, were greeted with praise from their comrades. "You guys did awesome. Can't wait to run it myself," said one. "That teamwork was pristine," sounded another, meeting Moran with a clasp of their palms and bumped shoulders. As they began to settle, Faith called for the next group. "Spears, Despa. Gather your fire teams and get in your pods." They acknowledged his order, and the 8 convened with their teams and into their respective pods. It was bare bones compared to the real thing, but it did its job in its seating arrangement. Jay kept his rifle across his chest, with the sling keeping it close as he settled into the seat. When he was situated, the doors closed and began to lower to the level of the arena. It was dark, and the only light present was what filtered through the glass of the pod door. After passing through a small section of darkness, he was revealed once again, and he was able to peek out into the arena. The walls depicted the outer walls of buildings, and the ground was like that of grass and pavement. It was an urban scenario, and several raised pylons were raised to an extent to resemble abandoned vehicles. His heart had begun to race, not out of anxiety or fear, but of pure adrenaline. He knew it all to be for training purposes, but it was one more step to being someone who could fight for those who couldn't defend themselves. He had since left the person he was before, and sought to become a version that could right the wrongs he wasn't fast enough to prevent, and he hated himself for it. This practical was another test for him to overcome, but this time, he had others to count on, and as he thought about this, a call came to his helmet from their sergeant. "Spears, Despa, you guys ready?" he asked, to which they responded in a hearty rah, followed by those in their respective teams. The doors for them opened with a taxing whir, and when they opened, they were met with the entirety of their scenario. Just as he saw from his windows, it was reminiscent of an urban environment. Walls of buildings and abandoned cars littered their view, and when he was met with no resistance, he looked above and found that instead of glass, the likeness of a sky was depicted above them. If not for the random flat edges, he would have thought he was in another world, or transported to one digitally. Jay then readied his rifle for the trial before him as Spears began to give their orders. All right, let's move up. Jay, Cam, get ready to breach that door to the left, Fields. Watch the road, he ordered. Spears then looked towards Despa and his group, who decided to breach their building altogether, leaving only Fields to man the road. Blasted tool. Fields, set up on that car while we secure our building, he said. Their arena was set up similar to Moran's, with a set of rooms on the sides of the arena. Instead of being closed off from each other until the end, there was an entire road at which the enemy could traverse. Faith noticed this as he stood above and watched as they moved through their area. Despa's team had completely disregarded the road and went straight for the building, which in Faith's eyes could have led to their doom if not for Spears and his thinking. It was common sense for most leaders, and he was ashamed such a simple tactic was overlooked. He knew he was going to have to rectify this later. As Jay, Cameron, and Spears entered through the door, they flowed as a rough river, with their movements lacking finesse and practice. But they were effective in their shot placement, as pirates would move to meet them, and Jay would neutralize them as they rounded a corner. Cam offered fire support when Jay would reload, and would move up after doing so. It was still imperfect, but Faith could sense that they trusted each other greatly, and as they proceeded, their movements began to smoothen out for the remainder of the time until they reached near the end of the building. However, besides them in the road, Fields fought for his life. Spears! Jay! Guys! We got pirates, center field! He announced over comms as he fired his rifle at the moderately paced pirate horde. Jay! Cam! Move it! Fields got pirates! Move to flank! He ordered. The three advanced at a faster pace, while still trying to maintain effective awareness as they breached the final door that led them out of their building. With his muzzle raised, Cam opened the door while Jay cleared their exit by circling it in a wide arc. When there were no threats present, he and Cam moved to the road to meet the pirates, with Spears watching their rear flanks. The horde was beginning to slow, but their numbers still overwhelmed Fields. Cam began firing from the corner of their building, while Jay moved behind a vehicle that he used for cover to manage the left flank. Quickly, they reduced the numbers to a handful, then eventually, nothing. Fields was the only one who stood opposite of Jay and Cam, rejoicing. Hell yeah, I thought I was going to get zapped if not for you two. By the way, where's Despa and his crew? Commented Fields. Noting their absence, they collectively looked at the set of buildings his team went through and assumed the worst. The door had opened, and 3 out of the 4 exited, with 2 of them holding on to one person who seemed unconscious. With a buzz, the arena began to shift to its blank state, and Faith spoke to them on their success. Good work, Spears. Your direction just saved the rest of you. Despa, talk to me after, he said as they walked to their extraction. To Jay, it seemed short, but in reality, 25 minutes had lapsed, when he thought it had been just 10. As they left, other teams took their place in the arena, with some failing and others succeeding. It was necessary for their training, and they would undergo it for their time in space until they reached their destination. Their day ended, with their team making several more rounds through the arena, with Faith even sanctioning a 4 versus 4 near the end, and the highlight of their day. 6 months have passed since boarding their transport vessel, which also acted as a mobile field environment. It suited their needs sufficiently with the training instilled in them by their superiors. It had just been after their most recent scenario in the arena that Jay and his fire team were on their break after going against another team of fledgling raiders. Talk about a close one, said Fields as he removed his helmet and began chugging water from his canteen. Cameron added to his comment and did the same. You think they're upset? The two looked across from them on another set of benches of the team they had gone against. They were worn and tired, with visible beads of sweat dampening their hair with their helmets removed. Their heads were hung low, and their defeat was obvious. Despa's a decent leader, but he likes to get ahead of himself, added Spears. He took a drink and stood before the 3, with Jay sitting quietly as he read from a data pad. What you reading? He asked. Jay looked up to the 3 who turned to him as he answered, A missing persons form. Sent it before we shipped off, and they finally got back to me, he said in a solemn tone. A missing person request? For who? Added Cameron, taking a moment to peer at the device. Jay was unbothered by his peering, and turned it for both Cameron and Fields to have a better look. Alexandria Farron, he said, reeling the pad back to himself. The 3 were confused at first, seeing how it was their first time hearing the mention of a woman, thinking it to be his friend, or perhaps his lover. "Alexandria? How'd she go missing?" asked Fields, who was then followed by Cameron. "Who is she?" added Cameron, but saw Jay's expression lower. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" He tried to retract his question, but Jay shook his head, knowing their intentions were pure and innocent. "She was my co-pilot's, my brother's fiancée. We were headed to Dema on a data run when we were attacked by Celian ships. We didn't know at the time, so we thought they were pirates and tried to flee to TRSC space. We made it to Draxus, but that got hit before we could alert the nearest TRSC fleet. Next thing we knew, we jumped the edge of the sector and thought we were clear, but a single ship knocked us. I scuttled it, but Cam was killed by shrapnel." For the three, it seemed like a lot of information for what seemed like an innocent question, but Spears saw that it weighed heavily on Jay. He placed a shoulder on his comrade, but Jay shed no tears, as much as he wanted to. He felt hollow, having survived so far, but he continued. "I only learned after the fact that after we made our run, he would introduce me to Alex. She lived on Dema, and that was going to be his last run for a while because she was going to have twins. Results came back, though. Inconclusive. The rest could see that her fate, and that of her children, aided him, and it had just now begun to surface. Seeing how well he fought in light of his emotional distress, Spears was still confident in his ability to fight, but offered words of reassurance, not as his team leader, but as a friend. I'm sure that once this war is over, we'll be able to find her. We already have their Navy packing, so once we drop and win this thing, I'm sure we'll have more to work with," said Spears. Cameron then chimed in, to raise Jay's morale even further. "That's right. I'm sure plenty of the advanced teams might have some intel of where they took them." Fields then added words of his own. "I hear a squad from Raptor Company is already on the planet. They're just waiting for the moment to strike." Jay appreciated their sentiment and placed the pad in a pouch designed for it. He returned a smile to the group as reassurance that he was fine. They were skeptical at first, but took to his words in confidence as their day came to a close with a final briefing. It was one they were expecting for their time in space, since their travel was artificially increased to allow for further training. It was, however, going to be their first largest mission straight from the depot, and it was common knowledge that in the current era, that didn't happen commonly. Even during their latest conflict some 3 to 4 years ago, with the end of the militia piracy revolution. As Jay knew it, and as he was taught during his recruit training, the MPR conflict began on the other side of TRSC space from where he was now, in an outer colony called Castus. In the end, the conflict was won by none other than the 4th ODR Battalion. He had some expectations to live up to, and he was determined to do so.